There we go. As well as the current co-editor of the Annual Review of Sociology. Dr. Massey's research focuses on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, near and dear to my heart, urban poverty, stratification, and Latin America, especially Mexico. He's the co-author of The Source of the River, the first analysis of minority achievement in selective colleges and universities based on a representative sample, as well as his current follow-up book that we were talking about a little bit earlier called Taming the River, which examines the determinants of persistence and great achievement through the first 2 years of college. Today, Dr. Massey will be speaking with us regarding race, segregation, and inequality in the United States. As we have talked about in class, despite declines of discrimination and prejudice, the US remains a very racially segregated society. This has had discrete impacts in how people treat one another, as well as factors like where they live, where they go to school, and where they get healthcare. Today, he will be speaking about how life chances in America have become very dependent on where and to whom you are born. With that, Dr. Massey.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but we're all learning to adapt in the times of COVID. I'm going to talk about residential segregation, its trends, causes, and consequences. I grew up in the 60s in Olympia, Washington, and Olympia, Washington had one Black person, and it's the state capital, with a Black population in both Tacoma and Seattle. But only in Olympia, there was only one person, and he was a blind guy who lived downtown and tuned all the pianos in town. So that was my childhood. And I've always been fascinated by difference. And I spent most of my professional career studying Latinos and African Americans and what life has been like for them as immigrants and as natives in this country, as it's changed so much between 1970, when I graduated from high school, and today. So I started studying segregation 43 years ago in 1977 for my PhD thesis. I noticed when I was looking around for a dissertation topic that no one had done a nationwide study of Latino segregation at that point in time. And so I used the 1970 census to cobble together data on Latinos and looked at how their patterns of segregation varied compared to African Americans. And what stood out at that point was how much more segregated African Americans were than, say, Mexicans in the Southwest, or Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, or Cubans in Florida. In 1970, of course, Latinos were only 4.7% of the US population compared to 18.3% today. So that was a different world. After I got my first academic job, I wrote a grant proposal to do another nationwide study of segregation with a larger set of metropolitan areas and focus on 3 groups: Blacks, whites, and Asians, and do a systematic comparison. And once again, what stood out was the depth and duration and tenacity of Black-white segregation compared to segregation patterns for other groups. So generally you had Blacks the most segregated, Asians much less segregated, Latinos in between, and depending on what part of the country and what kind of Latino, they would be either closer to Blacks or closer to whites, and closer to Asians in the segregation hierarchy. And so anyway, I wrote this book, American Apartheid, published back in 1993 with Nancy Denton, to bring segregation to the attention of scholars who I felt were ignoring the fact that the United States was remaining a very segregated society. At that time, when I was writing in the 1980s and 1990s, there's a big debate going on about the underclass and what caused it. And on the left, it was Charles Murray would say it's because we have an overgenerous welfare system and it disincentivized work. And then on the left, it would be William Julius Wilson talking about the structural change in the economy and the elimination of well-paying jobs for men without a lot of education. And neither side was really paying attention to the fact that the US was a very segregated place, and that would have consequences for whatever group was segregated. So for that reason, we wrote American Apartheid. Since then, I've been continuing to study segregation regularly, and I'm going to bring you up to date on things that have happened over the past several decades. Back when I wrote American Apartheid, I was using the 1980 census, and that was really the olden days of data work and computers. I had to get my data on these things called tapes. And to get tapes, I had to order like 25 tapes from the Census Bureau. And then to analyze the tapes, I would have to put a request in on a card reader. And then the card reader would jam half the time and I'd have to redo it. And then the card reader would read the instructions into the computer, but it would go to a computer technician who I had to wait for him to mount the tape and then run the tape. And then if all went well, I might get some output in a box somewhere a few hours later. That was computing back when I was a graduate student and an early scholar. Today, of course, I can go to Geolytics Corp and get digitized data on census tracts, neighborhoods, and all metropolitan areas in the area in the country from 1970 to the present. And so the work that I'm doing now is based on a much larger data set that we were able to process back in the dark ages of computing. So I'm going to draw on these two papers and talk a little bit about segregation and how it's changed over time. So this is the story of segregation in the 20th century. And you can think about segregation as happening at different geographic levels. And back in 1900, it didn't matter which level you looked at. African Americans were highly segregated from whites at every level. So they were segregated at the state level because in 1900, 95% of African Americans lived in the South and 90% in the rural South, and most whites didn't live in the rural South. They were segregated by county because the counties were in the South, and most of the counties outside the South were predominantly white. And they were segregated in cities as well by neighborhood. But levels of segregation were actually lowest at the neighborhood level because in the South, where most people live, where most African Americans lived, they didn't use residential segregation so much because they had social segregation. You could live near African Americans, but they had separate bathrooms, separate facilities, separate entrances, separate movie theaters, and whatnot. And in fact, in classical Southern cities, the residential pattern would be big mansions on wide streets with narrow alleys behind them where the Black servant class lived. So levels of segregation in the South actually weren't that high. But what happened over the next 70 years of the 20th century was the Great Black Migration, in which Black Americans moved out of the South into cities throughout the nation, urbanizing the Black population in the South and putting the center of gravity in metropolitan America rather than in rural America. And as the Great Black Migration went on, you can see from this graph that the segregation at the state level steadily fell as more Blacks came into the North, and Blacks and whites were no longer separated across state lines, and across county lines it also fell. And as Blacks moved into cities, what we saw is an increase in levels of segregation, rising up to very high levels by around 1970. And the Fair Housing Act was only passed in 1968. So basically that's the period in which segregation really got going in American cities. And in 1950, we can start picking up data on segregation across municipal boundaries. And you see that between 1950 and 1970, levels of segregation went up across municipal boundaries. And this is because with rapid Black immigration from the South into cities like Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and so on, we had, for the first time, municipalities that became majority Black. We never had a majority Black city outside of a few small towns in the South until the 1950s and 60s. And then cities like Gary, Baltimore, Washington, became majority Black cities. And that's a very different kind of segregation because it's segregation across a fiscal boundary as well as just a boundary in space. And so you're fiscally, financially isolated from the rest of the state because you're in different taxing districts. So this is a classic index of segregation, goes from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1.0. and it's the percentage of blacks and whites that would have to exchange neighborhoods to achieve an even residential distribution. Another one is called the isolation index. It's the percentage of African Americans in the neighborhood of the average black person. And you can see that that indicator of segregation at the neighborhood level went up dramatically in the course of the black migration as neighborhoods and cities filled up with more and more African Americans, and they became much more isolated spatially. And the level of isolation at the state and county level declined as we saw before, and fiscal isolation increased as well. So those are two different indices of segregation: isolation and evenness, as measured by the dissimilarity and isolation indices. When we wrote American Apartheid, I got some pushback saying, oh, you're exaggerating. The segregation we have in the United States is nothing like what we could see in South Africa. And at the time, I really couldn't argue with that, but later, census data from South Africa became publicly available. And when I computed the segregation statistics for the 20th century, you could see that it really wasn't much of an exaggeration. That segregation levels in South Africa, this solid line, were about the same as the levels of segregation in the United States. And this was de jure segregation by law, and this is de facto segregation created through other mechanisms. But the levels of segregation were high, and they don't begin to depart until after 1970, when the civil rights era happens in the United States and we start to see some changes. So now I'm going to focus on the trends since 1970 for trends for 287 metropolitan areas. Back when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I could only do about 20 metropolitan areas. Now I can do them all. And you see that black-white segregation measured with the dissimilarity index is going down steadily across the decades, falling by about 5 points per decade regularly, while segregation for Latinos and Asians has more or less stayed fairly stable, but slightly increased after 1990 in both groups, but not measurably so. What really changed was the degree of isolation. The black migration stopped around 1970. And so the neighborhoods were no longer filling up and the blacks were dispersing a bit. And so levels of segregation, levels of isolation were falling because of the decline in the degree of black and white unevenness across cities. But neighborhoods that contained Latinos were rapidly filling up with immigrants and their children. And so Latino segregation increased quite steadily. And now black and Latino segregation are at about the same level nationwide. But these trends are these are averages across 287 metropolitan areas. And they blend trends between places that are declining quite rapidly and places that aren't declining at all. So to get a better picture, you have to consider the variance, which I'll do in a second. But we talk a lot about minority segregation, but when you look at the data, the group that's really segregated is whites. This is the isolation index for whites at the top, you can see. And so you can see back in 1970, the average white person lived in a neighborhood that was 91% white and had very little contact with blacks or Latinos or Asians. And over time, that has gone down, but at a much slower pace than black segregation. And still today, or in 2010, the last census date, about 3/4 the average white person lived in a neighborhood where about 3/4 of the people were white, about 11% were Latino, about 8% were black, and about 7% were Asian. So they're still very isolated compared to other groups in the country. Now we'll talk a little bit about suburbanization and segregation and a concept that Nancy Denton and I developed called hypersegregation. Again, taken from publications. So this looks at the level of suburbanization in US metropolitan areas. And you can see that way back in 1970, as I was about to graduate from high school, the white part of the nation was about to become majority suburban. 49% lived in suburbs. And over the next 4 or 5 decades, that percentage increased to almost 2/3 now live in suburbs. Whites, Asians, Latinos, and blacks have also increased, but at a much slower pace and from a much more lower starting point. And they still remain predominantly concentrated in central cities. as you can see from the data here, and with Asians being most suburbanized, followed closely by Latinos, and then Blacks being the least segregated. This looks at patterns of segregation and isolation in central cities. So here you see high levels of, where to go? See, this is what we saw before, high levels of Black segregation in central cities coming down, Hispanics rising a bit, Asians much lower. And this is what you observe in suburbs. Segregation levels are lower for all three groups in suburbs. And the Black segregation does decline and gets down into the moderate range in suburbs. This looks at racial isolation using the isolation index. You can see that racial isolation has gone down in central cities, but in suburbs, it's almost 80%. The average white person lives in a neighborhood that's 80% white. And whites are much more isolated in suburbs than in central cities. And the degree of interaction between the degree of isolation of Hispanics has gone up in both places. And Asians have stayed fairly flat and unisolated in both places. This looks at segregation by income, and this I'm going to focus here on just the dissimilarity index rather than the left side. This is the degree of unevenness, the index we've been discussing, and you see that Asians, even at the bottom quintile, the bottom fifth of the income distribution, are just barely above the high level. Segregation indices of 60 and above are conventionally considered high, and they go below that as income rises. Likewise for Latinos, and we have data here from 1970, 80, 90, 2000. For Latinos, degree of segregation from whites is in the moderate range, below 60, and falls as income rises. And when you come down and look at African Americans, you see that in 1970 and 1980, income had actually absolutely no effect on the level of segregation experienced by Blacks. You couldn't blame it on income, but that Blacks were poorer than whites on average. And only in 1990 did we begin to see changes in segregation as income rose. And then there's a big drop in 1990, but then it stalled out and it hasn't changed very much. And you can see that in 2010, most affluent African Americans were more segregated than the poorest Hispanics. So there's something else going on. And one of the things that's going on is a much deeper kind of segregation experienced by African Americans that Nancy Denton and I called hypersegregation. When we were doing our initial work about segregation in the 1980s, there was a big debate in the field about how to measure segregation, and there were like 20 or 30 measures of segregation being proposed. I was getting very confused. So I used a technique called factor analysis to factor analyze all the indices, and found out that they all basically measured one of five dimensions: evenness and unevenness, which is what I showed you earlier; isolation, the concentration, the percentage Black in the neighborhood of the average Black person, and three other geographic dimensions: clustering, which is the degree to which Black neighborhoods are clustered together tightly in space instead of being scattered out like a checkerboard, and centralization, the degree to which Black neighborhoods are located in the older part of this core of the central cities, and concentration, the sheer density with which Black neighborhoods are populated. And we discovered that when you measure all five dimensions using separate indices, that only African Americans were segregated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And in a small set of cities, they were segregated across all five dimensions at the same time. And across an even larger set of cities, they were segregated out of four of the five dimensions at the same time. And so we called this hypersegregation if segregation indices were high on at least four of the five basic dimensions of segregation. And you can see the average score in hypersegregated cities at the top, on the solid line at the top, and the number of hypersegregated metropolitan areas on the dash line towards the bottom. You can see that the number of hypersegregated areas has declined from 40 in 1970 down to 21 in 2010. since we did our study based on the 1980 census, by 1990, we saw that Hispanics in New York and Los Angeles had become hyper-segregated as well. And when we did the larger data set analysis of all metropolitan areas in the country, we found that there were some other hyper-segregated cities for metropolitan areas for Latinos in the northeastern United States besides New York. And these show trends in hyper-segregated metropolitan areas for isolation and Black dissimilarity. And you can see Blacks are going down, Hispanics are going up, and they're meeting at still a very relatively high level of segregation in 2010. This is the residential experience of metropolitan African Americans, urban Blacks, basically in 2010. And you can see that 14% of all African Americans living in metropolitan America were living under conditions of hypersegregation in 5 indices, and another 18% on hypersegregated with 4 indices. And so it's about a third of all urban Blacks were living under conditions of hypersegregation, and another 21% were living under conditions of high segregation, and most of the rest were moderate, between 30 indices between 30 and 60 on a 100-point scale. So a majority of Blacks are still highly segregated in metropolitan areas, and an important subset, about a third of all African Americans, live under conditions of hypersegregation. And these are America's most segregated metropolitan areas, those that are segregated across 5 dimensions at the same time. And you see Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Flint, Detroit, Baltimore, and Birmingham, Alabama, the only one in the South. And Birmingham has actually increased over time. And you can see there's very little movement towards integration in these places. And these are the places where African Americans are suffering the highest degrees of segregation, the most disadvantaged, and living under the conditions of the highest concentration of poverty. These are places that are segregated on 4 of the 5 dimensions, and you see a lot of southern cities here. And southern cities actually tended to increase over time, and they were quite diverse before, and now they're becoming more and more concentrated here, and still in the high range above with a segregation index above 60 or 0.6. So the segregation there's not much of a sign of decline here either. What are the causes of segregation? Well, I've done some work on this as well, and I'm going to start out just by telling you what the factors are that predict high levels of segregation. Prejudice and discrimination, unfortunately, haven't gone away. I know that some people were encouraged by Barack Obama's election as president and looked forward to a post-racial era when we would get over our racial problems. But I think the election of Mr. Trump has disabused most people that race is an issue of the past. It's still very much with us. So prejudice and discrimination are an important factor. Suburban density zoning has emerged as an important driver of segregation in the post-civil rights period. Density zone, basically it's density zoning that is the big factor. Zoning regimes that limit the density of housing in suburbs around central cities have a big effect in driving up the cost of housing in suburbs. And in doing so, they promote both racial and class segregation. And class segregation, unlike black-white segregation, has actually been increasing over time. The age of the housing stock matters because the more housing that was built after the Civil Rights era, the more housing built after the 1968 Civil Fair Housing Act, the less segregated a metropolitan area is. So built environments don't change that much. There's a lot of immobility built into the built environment, and so the more new housing you have, the less segregated a metropolitan area is. Class segregation is correlated strongly with racial segregation because of the differences in income distribution between blacks and whites. Military presence in a metropolitan area has an interesting effect. The military is the most successfully integrated institution in American life. It was desegregated by command of the commander-in-chief in 1948 under Harry Truman, and it's a command system. So if the command comes down that you will get along, you will not display racism, or you won't get anywhere in this man's army, people obey. And places with large military populations, metro areas with large military populations are less segregated than other places. The bases themselves are not segregated, and they're part of the census. And even off base, when soldiers move off base, they tend not to segregate themselves like the rest of the country does. The presence of a college or university or multiple colleges and universities also lowers segregation, because that increases the population of people with college educations and higher levels of education, and tolerance for other races, and racism. Tolerance increases and racism declines as education goes up. Degree of urbanism matters. Larger cities tend to be more segregated on a variety of dimensions than smaller cities. And the minority percentage, the more minority members, a relative number of minority members in a metropolitan area, the greater the segregation. And finally, minority socioeconomic status matters, especially relative to whites. As minorities get more and more income and education, the levels of segregation do go down now. They just don't go down as much as for other groups. So one of the big problems historically was how do you measure prejudice at the metropolitan level? We have attitudinal surveys that show a decline in racial prejudice, but those surveys are nationwide samples of around 1,200 people. And so you can't develop an index on a metropolitan area basis. But now we're in an era of big data. And I discovered that you could use Google search trends on the N-word to measure anti-Black sentiment in different metropolitan areas. And when you do this, this is what you get. And the red ones are the ones with high levels of searches on this racial epithet. And you see that Flint, Michigan, which is one of the hyper-segregated cities, is very high. The highest score is in Wheeling, West Virginia. West Virginia, although it's not very urbanized and not very segregated, it is a very racially prejudiced state. It gave the highest share of its vote to Mr. Trump in the last election. And then you see out west and the newer cities, newer metropolitan areas, levels of prejudice are lower. And then there's a lot of cities in between. And this is the levels. This is a map showing levels of segregation. And so once again, you see there's a correspondence. That's not one-to-one, but there's a relationship between prejudice and high levels of segregation. I tried to construct an index of prejudice against Latinos as well. And I tried all kinds of epithets for Latinos, but none of them really picked up any variance in any way. But then I fed into the Google search trends, Google Trends index, search engine, the term illegal alien and variations on that term. And that's where I got a lot of meaningful variation. So you can see that that sort of prejudice against Latinos on the basis of perceived legal status is most severe out west and less severe in the Northeast and Midwest. And there's some correspondence between segregation and Latino segregation and anti-Latino sentiment, but the outliers here are up in the Northeast. And this, we know why this is the case, because in the Northeastern United States, it's the only part of the country where Mexicans are not the dominant group, and Caribbean Hispanics are the dominant group. And Caribbean Hispanics from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba are a multiracial population with a large Afro-Caribbean presence. And so if you look at their levels of segregation, they vary by racial identity, with Black Latinos in the Northeast being about as segregated as Black Americans, and white Latinos being much less segregated, and those of mixed race in between, falling between the two extremes, but towards the higher end of the scale. So this is just a data display that confirms everything that I talked to you about already. So you can see that prejudice matters in predicting Black segregation, the density zoning matters, the percent Black and the percent Hispanic matter, the ratio of minority income to white income lowers segregation, segregation between high income and low income people increases segregation, large population increases segregation, military population reduces segregation, and newer housing reduces segregation. So segregation is not something that is just a holdover from the past. It's being actively produced by certain factors in US metropolitan areas, and it explains a large share of the variation in segregation across metropolitan areas. So now I want to talk about consequences. And here, it's work I've done looking at segregation in the American foreclosure crisis, which erupted in the very end of 2007 and came to full bloom in 2008 and 2009, giving us the Great Recession of that period. With a graduate student, Jake Rue, who's now at Brigham Young University, we decided to look and see what the relationship between racial segregation and foreclosure was. So we estimated this simple model. It's just a bunch of terms in an equation. And this is what we found when we looked at the data. So we saw African and black-white segregation and black isolation within neighborhoods were strong predictors of both the total number of foreclosures as well as the foreclosure rate. You get the same result, with segregation being a very strong predictor. And then when you look at the effect sizes, these are the effect sizes, you see that out of all the things that might affect foreclosure ratings, here, subprime loan share, house price inflation, housing starts ratio, changes in unemployment, credit score index, that segregation was the biggest single factor in the model predicting foreclosures. So then we had to figure out why that is. And it turns out it has to do with the transformation of the home lending industry. And it's really an outgrowth of the development and popularization of mortgage-backed securities, which created a huge demand for mortgages. In the old world, banks would make mortgages to people who wanted to buy homes, and then they would the bank would examine people's creditworthiness, give them a loan, and the people would pay back the bank over a period of time, over usually a 30-year period, and that would lead to low monthly payments, allowing home ownership to become a mass commodity in the United States. And if you got into a little bit of trouble and you had trouble with your payments, you could renegotiate with your banker and probably continue to pay off the mortgage. But that system is all gone now. Now, middlemen originate mortgage brokers go out and try to create mortgages, and then they take the mortgages and then they sell them to financiers in Wall Street, to firms like Goldman Sachs. And then people at Goldman Sachs will take those all these different mortgages and then package them together to back a security, a bond they sell on markets to investors. And so no longer is are the number of mortgages constrained by the capital a bank has on hand to lend. It's only constrained by what the market for mortgage-backed securities can bear. And the binding constraint becomes the number of mortgages that you can generate. And the credit worthiness of borrowers is not seen as an issue because some subprime loans carry higher interest rates and more payoffs and more fees for the people who originate them. And they can be bundled with conventional loans at lower interest rates to manage the risk, at least in theory. And this created a hugely profitable cycle. So mortgage brokers would generate loans, immediately sell them to security firms. Firms would divide them into risk tranches. Tranches is a French word for like a segment, like a tranche of a pie. Then they'd repackage the loans into different tranches into bonds that are sold to investors. The rating agencies would give the bonds a AAA rating in the belief that the risk was controlled by the diversification of tranches and by the fact also that the Goldman Sachs was paying them to rate the bond, and if they didn't rate the bond, Goldman Sachs would take their business elsewhere. So they give them an easy AAA rating, and all these actors make money while assuming no risk. So the brokers make money, the securities firm makes money, the rating agencies makes money, and the investors think that they're managing risk through credit default swaps, but that didn't prove to be the case. So this set off an intense search for borrowers. In this context, formerly excluded clients became extremely attractive. Racial segregation creates of poor minorities creates a natural market for subprime lending because you have geographic concentrations of financially unsophisticated and historically underserved minority homeowners all living in one place. And Black neighborhoods become easy targets for subprime lending by unscrupulous brokers. And so segregation is linked to racially targeted subprime lending. Segregation created a dual racially segmented mortgage market, and controlling for individual and neighborhood characteristics, the rate of subprime lending is significantly higher to Blacks and Latinos, and it's significantly higher in segregated cities. From 1993 to 2000, the share of subprime mortgages in minority neighborhoods went from 2 to 18%, and minorities were significantly more likely to receive unfavorable terms on their loans, with high prepayment penalties, high cost ratios, larger rate spreads, and so on. And this holds at all income levels. And in fact, the discrimination is higher the higher the income of the Black household, because that's where the money is. And here we can see the segregation subprime link. On the x-axis, you see the level of Black-white segregation. On the y-axis, you see the gap in the percentage of mortgages that are subprime for Blacks and whites. A big gap indicates that there's a lot of discrimination going on. And you see up at the top here, all the hyper-segregated cities. And we can use this to do a causal analysis using a technique known as two-stage least squares to show that the degree of African-American segregation is not simply correlated with mortgage, the foreclosure rates and foreclosure numbers, but it's a causal relationship. It's really part of the cause of what's going on. So we concluded from this analysis that racial segregation was an important contributing cause of the US foreclosure crisis, and the effect of segregation is independent of other economic causes of the crises, and the explanatory power of segregation exceeds that of other factors hitherto identified as causes, and neither the number nor the rate of foreclosures is any way related to the expanded lending to minority homeowners as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act. It's not done by federally backed entities like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. It was done by private label security vendors. So this had consequences for African Americans, and especially their wealth. So we looked at, in this study, we got all the mortgages issued by banks in the city of Baltimore from 2000 to 2008, just when the mortgage bubble burst. And we collected all kinds of borrower level and tract level information from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, available under the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and loan level records of mortgage-backed securities, private label and mortgage-backed securities, securitized by both private sector and the government, like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And the data set gave us 2,526 loans made to non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites in the city of Baltimore between 2000 and 2008. And then we looked at things like the subprime loan, whether the interest rate spread was high, a combined risk loan, whether at least two of a set of risk features were present on the mortgage. And then we looked at the monthly payment, whether the person the household entered foreclosure, and whether the home is repossessed. So here, these are regression models. I know if you're not a statistician, these kind of look daunting, but what the red things at the top show is that Black borrowers are much more likely to get a subprime loan. And this stays true when you control for all the things that go into whether a person gets a loan or not. We had everything on the loan applications to control for. And then this looks at whether they got a risky loan. And again, you see Black people in Black borrowers and people living in Black tracts were much more likely to get subprime loans and combined risk loans. And because they were because they had high cost, high risk loans, they are much more likely to go into foreclosure, as you can see here, and much likely to enter into repossession and put their money at risk. And we use this to do a counterfactual analysis where we looked at, we used the equation that predicted for whites whether they got a subprime loan or a high risk loan and a high cost loan. And then we estimated what blacks would have been, the terms of loan blacks would have gotten if they'd been treated like whites. We find that blacks were paying 6% more per month in their monthly payments. That came up to $532 a month extra, $1,800 from the time the loan was originated to the time that we were collecting the data. And if they were to pay for the entire life of the loan, they would pay more than $16,000 compared to whites. And the penalties were even greater for people with had higher incomes because that's where the money was. Because of this, they were more likely to enter into foreclosure and end up with $46,000 threatened with foreclosure, or in the city of Baltimore, a total of $3.5 million threatened, and then actually entered foreclosure and the money taken away, the home repossessed. So in Baltimore, the average loss was about $43,000 in home equity and about almost $2 million taken out of the Black community wealth. This wealth that was extracted out of the Black community by predatory lending. And when the largest lender nationwide and in Baltimore was Wells Fargo, and a civil rights law firm in Washington, D.C. sued Wells Fargo, alleging discrimination. And at first, Wells Fargo stonewalled, but then when we did our analysis, we were expert witnesses for this case. They immediately settled the case for a $175 million fine that would go to homeowners that had been victimized in Baltimore. And it was jointly decided with the same analysis done in Memphis, Tennessee, and they settled there as well. And they've been settling lawsuits throughout the country using our model as the means of demonstrating discrimination in different metropolitan areas. So in order to get down further at this, we did a qualitative analysis where we looked at the written record that had been created by all these lawsuits that had been filed. So these are all the lawsuits that were filed alleging discrimination by bankers and mortgage originators to mortgage brokers in the aftermath of the housing bubble. And 4 cases went to trial: Barclay v. Olympia Mortgage in Brooklyn, New York. And the 2 big ones were Wells Fargo Bank versus Citibank, City of Baltimore, Wells Fargo versus City of Memphis. Those are the ones we were expert witnesses in, and Adkins versus Morgan Stanley. And this yielded a whole bunch of declarations, depositions, and other exhibits that provide a window on what was going on during the mortgage boom. And the largest top subprime lender was, in fact, Wells Fargo. So we did a content analysis of all these depositions and statements and testimonies, did a random sample of these, and then we did a systematic coding to see whether there was individual discrimination in evidenced by the person being interviewed. Oops. Sorry. Interviewed. Individual discrimination or structural discrimination. And structural discrimination was a process or procedure in which seemingly race-neutral behavior inevitably led to a discriminatory outcome. And then we also tested for potential discrimination, but that was so common we didn't even bother to analyze it. We did data coding done independently by 2 of the authors of the paper, and they labeled the text as either evidence present, evidence not present, or not applicable. And we cross-checked, and they agreed 86% of the time. So it's a very reliable coding. And here's what we found. Mostly it was structural discrimination that was a phenomenon. 76% of the transcripts we looked at gave evidence of structural discrimination. And here's some of the quotes. So that display structural discrimination. So these are people that are mortgage brokers working for mortgage firms, and so the question from the lawyer was, would your split be higher if the borrower paid a higher interest rate? The answer: if the company made a little more money, I would make more money. The The commission and referral system at Wells Fargo was set up in a way that made it more profitable for a loan officer to offer a prime customer for a subprime loan than to make a prime loan directly to the customer. So there's incentives built into pushing people into high-risk loans. The trading desk also set the bid terms and purchase terms for those loans. The trading desk decisions were not the workings of some lone rogue employees. Instead, it was essential to Morgan Stanley's business model to vest the trading desk with the ultimate power to decide which loans to buy, regardless of their quality, because doing so maximized the supply of New Century loans and the cash flow from those loans. I complained many times about what I thought were unethical or predatory loan practices that Wells Fargo was engaged in. Managers never took any actions to respond to my concerns. In my office, we morbidly joked that we were riding the stagecoach to hell. That's the title we gave our article, stagecoach, of course, being the symbol for Wells Fargo. We're running short of time, so let me give you some indication of both individual and structural discrimination. One person said outright in the testimony, Wells Fargo management tolerated a culture of discrimination. Wells Fargo discriminated against minority loan applicants by not offering them better or new products which had lower fixed rates and fees. Another technique would be to tell the customer the only way to get the loan closed would be to submit it as a subprime loan. And then, of course, they would pay more money and experience more risk. Elderly African Americans were thought to be particularly vulnerable and were frequently targeted for subprime interest rates. I remember one instance where an elderly African American woman who was over 65 could not qualify for a subprime loan that the manager warned her to put her in. And so the credit manager convinced her to transfer the property to her son so the subprime loan could be made to her son's name. And then, of course, the house was later repossessed and the family lost their money. It was the practice at Wells Fargo offices where I worked to target African Americans for subprime loans. It was generally assumed that African Americans were less sophisticated and intelligent and could be manipulated more easily into subprime loan with expensive terms than white customers. I heard people joking with one another about the race of customers, saying things like, "Oh, you know that guy's so smart. Is it because he's black?" In the interest of time, I'll finish up here with one final analysis, which I did in collaboration with Brandon Wagner, who I believe is on your faculty, and with a lot of other people. And this is getting at the health consequences. One thing we know about health, when you look at blacks and whites, there's a huge gap in almost any outcome of health: life expectancy, infant mortality, morbidity, sickness, a variety of diseases, a variety of health conditions. The situation is always worse for blacks on average. And very early on, we discovered in demography that when you controlled for income and education and things like that, those discrepancies weakened a bit, but they didn't go away. And so what we argue here is that because rising income and rising education don't allow African Americans to get to the same quality neighborhoods that they get for whites and other groups in American society, that they experience much worse neighborhood conditions. And it's the neighborhood conditions and the high levels of concentrated disadvantage and violence they're exposed to in neighborhoods that really are responsible for the health differentials. And we developed a biosocial model for this. So we have a high rate of poverty in among African Americans and a high level of segregation among African Americans. And together those yield concentrated disadvantage, concentrated poverty, concentrated violence. And that's going to have physiological effects on people, on telomere length, allostatic load, and on gene expression. Allostatic load is an overstimulation of the stress response system, which can cause damage over the long term. And gene expression, it turns out that genes do not simply get inherited and expressed, duly expressed. They are expressed in interaction with the environment. But what we're going to focus on here is telomere length. Telomere lengths, this is a chromosome, and telomeres are these things at the end of the chromosomes, the chromatid packages that protect the integrity of the genetic information which is in the chromosome during the process of cell replication. And every time a cell replicates, it takes a little bit off the chromatid at the end and wears the telomeres down slowly over time. So with aging, the telomeres get narrower and narrower, and that increased the risk of something going wrong in genetic cell division and things like cancer or autoimmune responses occurring. This here illustrates the vast difference in neighborhood characteristics that blacks and whites have. This is an indicator of neighborhood disadvantage. And you see the vast majority of whites live at much lower levels of disadvantage than the vast majority of blacks. Yeah, and even when you control for income, these differences hold. So we did this analysis with telomeres, and here we show that that blacks have longer telomeres than whites on average, and that's a matter of considerable discussion about why that is. But they lose their telomeres at a much higher rate because they're exposed to much higher levels of disadvantage, and that with rising disadvantage, telomeres shorten very, very rapidly, very quickly. As disadvantage increases. So what this means is that because of segregation, blacks live in poor neighborhoods, highly concentrated poverty, high disadvantage, high social disorder, and high levels of violence. And this exposure has physiological effects on African Americans, shortening the telomeres at the end of their chromosomes and increasing the likelihood that they will experience health maladies as they age. It's what some social scientists call the weathering hypothesis, that the harsher conditions that African Americans face weathers them and causes their health to deteriorate over time. And here we show that it's happening among women. These women are in their 30s. They're not very old, and already their telomeres are beginning to attrit because of exposure to violence and disorder, because of segregation, building a future of bad health into their lives at a very young age. So I've given you a very lightning round discussion of the work that I've done over the past 10 years, looking at the trends, causes of segregation. And if people have questions or comments, I'd be happy to try to answer them. I'm sorry for the length.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you. I am going to go to the Q&A section and see that there are people asking questions. Okay, so we have the first question from anonymous attendee. Can you please tell us why you think Mr. Trump is racist? Because a lot of people do not think that.
I think because he pretty much says it very bluntly. He said it in the past. He said it in president. He tiptoes around it, but leaves a distinct impression that there's good people on both sides of the race issue. Good people in the Ku Klux Klan, good people in Black Lives Matter, and good people in the Ku Klux Klan are racists, of course, by definition. So he's endorsing these points of view, and the Trump organization in its departments that it rented got sued 3 times by the Justice Department for discrimination against African Americans, and each time settled out of court and paid fines. But they kept coming back, and they would still be caught again. So it's a long history.
Let's see. Next question. What was it like to serve as an expert witness in the case against Wells Fargo? Was it difficult to adapt your academic work to make it accessible for a lay audience?
That's always hard to do, but I try to put it in simple terms and try to explain things in intuitive ways. And the hardest thing is to work with lawyers because I'm an academic and I care about saying things that are true and that can be backed up with evidence. And the lawyers just want to win. And so they want me to say things. They want me to say things that will help their case. And if I say things that are slightly bent and bending the truth a bit, they might even be more happy than they are. And they're always kind of pushing me to see how far I'll go based on what the data say. So that's the biggest tension. But I strongly believe in evidence, and everything that I do and say when I do expert witnessing goes through a peer review process where other people can attack it to find defects. And if you think my liberal colleagues in social science just love to approve everything I do, you're very much mistaken. They love to criticize other people, and they love to take big names like me down a few pegs if they can. And so you go through harsh criticism and you get rid of the flaws. And it also keeps me honest. I bring that point of view to my work as an expert witness.
And I saw a bunch of hands just go up. Please feel free to ask your question in the Q&A box so I can read it for Dr. Massey. And yes, we certainly love through the peer review process to criticize one another. Sometimes perhaps get a little bit too personal, but it is a good process most of the time. Okay. Going along with being a Phi Beta Kappa talk, do you feel that having a strong foundation in the liberal arts and sciences positively impacted your ability to participate in interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research projects?
Yeah, as an undergraduate, I was very indecisive, and I had a hard time picking a major. So I finished 3 majors in the end. One in Spanish, because I started studying Spanish in 3rd grade, and I took it 7 through 12. And I didn't want to forget Spanish. And so I took a course every quarter. And if you do that for 4 years, you get a major, whether you want one or not. And I started out in psychology and finished a major in psychology. And then I decided I didn't like experimental science that much because it was in a laboratory and not too far from the real world. And then I switched over to anthropology. And then I got disaffected with anthropology because everything was culturally relevant and you couldn't come to any conclusions. Culturally relative. And then in my senior year, I discovered demography. And I decided I wanted to be a demographer because demographers use data. They believe in evidence. It's real world. It's about birth, death, life, migration, marriage, all these real things. And they can agree on things if the data tell them to do things. So I went and got a PhD in sociology. And as a sociologist, I started studying international migration as well. And for that, I had to pick up economics. So I got kind of cross-trained in a lot of different social science disciplines and have a background in anthropology, psychology, economics, and sociology. And of course, I'm a demographer.
Okay. We have a question. You studied in Mexico. What part of Mexico did you study, and how can you compare that, and I'm going to assume that means Mexican segregation, with segregation today in America regarding Blacks, Mexicans, and Hispanics?
Well, I've been working in Mexico since 1982, and I've been almost everywhere in Mexico. My base of operations for the research has been Guadalajara, University of Guadalajara, but I've also done work in Mexico City at the Colegio de Mexico and the CIDE, the Centro de Investigaciones y Docencias Económicas in Mexico City. And if you look at levels of segregation in Mexico, they have fairly high levels of class segregation. And class segregation is quite extreme. It's much higher than it is in the United States. And there's also a fair amount of racial segregation, although it's harder to measure. Mexico has an official ideology. It's a mestizo country, mestizaje, a combination, a blend of indigenous and Spanish and some African, creating a mixed culture and society and a mixed population. So their ideology is kind of a mixture. But in reality, there's a lot of skin color stratification and skin color segregation in Mexico that persists. A good book about skin color stratification generally in Latin America is a book called Pigmentocracies by Edward Tellez, who's now at UC Santa Barbara, I think. And it's an analysis of skin color stratification in about 6 or 7 Latin American countries, including Mexico. So yes, stratification is a big issue in Mexico, but it's more indigenous mestizo versus European than black versus others in Mexico. There are a couple of pockets of black settlement in Veracruz and Oaxaca, but mostly it's issues between the indigenous and European spectrum.
We have a question in the factor analysis, more of a methods question. What were the 5 factors that you used? The student says that she has clustering, concentration, and centralization.
First one was evenness, which is measured by the index of dissimilarity. And the second one was isolation, measured by the isolation index. So those are the two main indices I was using throughout the analysis. And then you're right, those are the other three. So there are five: evenness, unevenness, isolation, clustering, concentration, and centralization.
Okay. We have another question. Is there a general correlation between stress and certain telomeres across races?
There appears to be. That's something. This is a very new field, and it's something we're all in the process of investigating. But it seems we know that for all human beings, exposure to high levels of stress and stressful environments is going to shorten telomeres. Telomeres were only discovered about 15 or 20 years ago by a woman named Liz Blackburn at the University of California, San Francisco, and she won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry for this. And she discovered what they were and what they did, and then to look and see how they reacted to stress. She was it's a teaching hospital, the University of California. It's a medical school, and so she looked at caregivers, and she compared caregivers that were giving care to Alzheimer's patients and caregivers that were giving care to people who were less stressful, and then people who weren't giving any care at all. And she found that people that were under great stress because they're caring for relatives who had Alzheimer's, their telomeres were radically shortened over a period of time. And so that was the first indication that environments could really affect telomere attrition over time. And since then, more and more social scientists have been building telomere measures into their surveys and allowing us to look at how different sources of stress in their environments can affect the telomere attrition. And we've shown neighborhood conditions can affect them, family conditions, poverty, all kinds of things. So any kind of stress over a prolonged period of time will have believed to have that effect. And we're, as far as we can tell, it happens across races. And we don't exactly know why there are differences between the races in kind of the starting length of telomeres. That's still a matter of investigation.
We have a question. How large a role would you say single-family zoning plays in urban segregation? Even in purportedly liberal neighborhoods, e.g. Minneapolis, there's opposition to apartment construction on the grounds of increased noise and parking difficulties. Even requiring the proposed apartments to be near subway or train stations, thus mitigating auto traffic, can sometimes attract opposition.
Yeah, well, I think some liberal, probably a lot of liberal rights are kind of hypocritical on this issue. And there was a bond issue, a voting issue, a referendum in California to do exactly what you said, to build, to allow high density housing, forbid restrictive density zoning around transportation centers. And it was rejected. It drives up the cost of housing, which is why the housing costs are so expensive. And almost by definition, that'll create class segregation, and it also contributes to racial segregation. So it's a very important driver of segregation, both class and racial and ethnic segregation in the United States today. Now, in the state of New Jersey, where Princeton is, New Jersey has a state constitution that the state Supreme Court has interpreted to state that municipalities cannot write zoning regulations to preclude the construction of affordable housing. And indeed, that each municipality has an affirmative obligation to provide for the need for affordable housing. And so I worked with a group for lawsuits in New Jersey, and I've done an evaluation of an affordable housing project that opened with 140 units of affordable housing in a predominantly white and affluent neighborhood that's a suburb of Philadelphia, across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, called Mount Laurel. And we found that the opening of this 140 units of fully affordable housing, 90% Black and Latino, in an affluent white neighborhood, had no effect on taxes, no effect on home values, and no effect on crime. Wow. That all the there was a huge debate beforehand and dire predictions were made. But when we did the careful analysis, the quasi-experimental analysis, we found no effect whatsoever. And when we did a survey of the next door neighboring communities, the neighborhoods directly adjacent to the neighborhood where the development was built, a third of the people didn't even know there was an affordable project next to them. And we found that for the people who moved in, again, a quasi-experimental analysis showed that being able to move out of really disadvantaged, segregated neighborhoods in places like Trenton and Camden and North Philadelphia gave them a huge boost up on the ladder of life. And they were launched on a course of upward mobility, and it turned them from welfare dependent people into taxpayers and increased their employment, increased their earnings, increased their employment rates, increased their mental health, improved their work habits, and provided a huge boost in the education of their kids, who got to move from a failing school district into a good school district.
Wow, that's fascinating.
That's what we call climbing Mount Laurel.
I'm gonna bring that into my introduction to sociology class. That's great. Have the numbers for trends in neighborhood level isolation indices remained on the same path over the last decade, or have they altered at all?
Well, we've got a few indicators indicating that they've continued to go up, but we're really waiting for the 2020 census, and we'll see how that comes out. I'm a little worried about the 2020 census. I was on the Census Scientific Advisory Committee for 6 years, and I was worried before about the census because it's the first online census that's ever been attempted, and a lot of things can go wrong. And then there's been a lot of political manipulation going on in the census, trying to end it prematurely, trying to insert the citizenship question, which was against all the advice of the Census Bureau, and it violated all the principles of data integrity that the Census Bureau has. And I was part of a lawsuit to stop the citizenship question, which fortunately worked. But and then on top of all those other the political problems and the technical problems, we got COVID. So it's not a pretty picture for the census, and demographers are all pretty concerned about it. But the 2020 census will be when people start doing a lot of studies on segregation again, because it's 100% count.
Have you made any policy recommendations for remedying the contemporary segregation trends that were highlighted in your presentation?
Well, I've made a number of suggestions over time. One is to move away from density restrictive zoning and encourage housing mobility programs that allow people to move out of poor neighborhoods into better and more affluent neighborhoods with different kinds of housing subsidies. And you can do this by building affordable housing in affluent places and letting people move there. Or the other way to do it is to give people subsidies, a housing voucher of some sort that they can take and use it in the housing market to move into a better neighborhood and have the government pay part of the rent. And all these methods have been shown to produce much better outcomes for people and allow them to move up in the world and get out of poverty and not have any negative effects on the neighborhoods involved when these programs are run correctly. And finally, in addition to housing mobility and getting away from density restrictiveness in zoning, there's just simply enforcement of anti-discrimination law. Most of the civil rights legislation that was passed in the 60s and 70s was passed in compromises, in which, in return for getting to say in federal law that discrimination was illegal, the government was disempowered from enforcing it, and it basically relies on private citizens to file suits in federal courts. But that's not really a very effective means of enforcement. So I have been advocating stronger enforcement measures through testing programs that use audit studies to send Blacks and whites or Latinos and and non-Hispanic whites into housing exchanges to see how things turn out. And when that's done, we generally find relatively high levels of discrimination still persist in housing markets. I did one study in Philadelphia that I just randomly sampled apartment ads from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and had people call up speaking Black accented English versus white English, white middle class English. And there was a lot of discrimination just based on the accent that people heard over the phone.
Yeah, that's similar to all the resume experiments, right? That Diva Pager used to do, right?
Diva Pager and a bunch of economists are doing this now too. Yeah, you can take identical resumes and change the names to Black sounding, Latino sounding, Asian sounding, or white sounding names, and you'll get very different outcomes even with the same resume.
So you discussed how those in the military and those who are higher education are generally less segregated. We know that much of segregation is systemic, but how much of a role do individual choices play? How do we make choices in our lives to help reduce some of the segregations that we will experience over time?
Well, that's a difficult question. It's a lot of it is structural, but structure gets replicated in people's heads. And builds biases into the way we think about things, both implicit biases that we're not really aware of and explicit biases. And there's a good book that talks about this called The Cycle of Segregation by a couple of sociologists, demographers, Kyle Crowder and Maria Kreison. And they do a lot of experiments showing that, people's willingness to move into a neighborhood or the attractiveness of a neighborhood is really dependent on whether or not they see Black people or Black faces. So you could have the same house and then you have a Black family sitting out in front or a white family sitting out in front, and it'll be people's reaction to it will be entirely different. So it gets built into people's cognitive structures too. And that's a tougher nut to crack. Even people who don't want to be racist or aren't racist have implicit biases. And having implicit bias doesn't mean you're a racist. It means you grew up in a racially segmented country, racialized country. So Black people have the same biases, and it's very difficult to get rid of these, but you can overcome them once you're aware of them and control them. So, but it's a tougher issue for sure.
Eli Anderson, who is a professor at Yale of sociology, once said to me that the first thought that you have is the thought that society has conditioned you to have. And the second thought is the one that you try and use your critical thinking skills to come up with.
Well, I know Eli pretty well. We co-edited a book together, and I taught on the Penn faculty with him for about 17 years. So yeah, he's right about that.
Okay, we have another question. Do you think, did the different levels of geographic segregation correlate with different long-term outcomes? I.e., is it worse to have segregated cities versus neighborhoods?
I think it's bad to have both segregated cities and neighborhoods. Segregation never works to the advantage of the segregated person. It was bad when Detroit was segregated within the city and Blacks lived in different parts of the city. But at least Blacks and whites shared a city government, shared a tax base. And so whites had an interest in Black welfare because they shared the same city. But as Detroit emptied out and became 90% Black, and all the whites were in the suburbs, then white voters who make decisions don't have much of a self-interest in spending money in Detroit. This can be just pure self-interest apart from race. Why spend over there when I need things here? But if people have racial prejudices, then it makes it much easier to disinvest in African Americans. One of the things about segregation is that segregation makes other forms of exploitation and discrimination easy and efficient. And that's why the Union of South Africa set up the Group Areas Act in the first place when it came to power in 1948.
Okay. What are the active paths to resolving segregation in modern America? For example, in Lubbock in the South, we've gotten rid of Jim Crow laws, supposedly, and the most segregative law. For many politicians, especially in Lubbock, they feel that because these laws do not exist anymore, that segregation has been dealt with, and that we should simply move on from that. How do we motivate our leaders to not only acknowledge segregation, but actively do something to mitigate it? Especially in small towns where the budget for lawsuits against the city and the ability to prove in a court of law that segregation is continuing is not likely an avenue of resolution.
Yeah, well, it's a political process for sure. And I try to build on evidence and then get people to pay attention to the evidence and then get politicians to act on the basis of the evidence. I think a lot of Americans aren't aware, a lot of white Americans aren't aware of the degree to which racial discrimination and exclusion and exploitation are actually baked into a lot of systems in the country. And you saw it pretty live when I was talking about Wells Fargo and how it took advantage of Black segregation and began to systematically peddle predatory loans to Black neighborhoods. They would go to Black churches, get address lists from Black pastors for prospects to call. They would go into Black businesses and they would get lists of people that were buying on credit in their businesses and then target them. They could figure out which phone exchanges were for Black neighborhoods and do robocalls. They could plaster neighborhoods with ads about, you too can get $10,000 out of your house. And Blacks were much more likely to be in refinance mortgages rather than new purchase mortgages because they were targeted, and Blacks had been redlined and denied access to credit for so long, but a small share had been able to buy their houses and actually own them outright by 2000, after 2000. And then these were the people that were targeted for predatory loans, home equity loans, and then they lost their home equity and their wealth. And this was a practice that also happened to Latinos at a later point in the process. And my former student, Jake Rue, has written extensively on that. And well, it turned out Wells Fargo was screwing over Americans in general, white people as well, without the bank account holder's permission, changing the terms of the bank account to make it more expensive. And when that hit the papers, it caused quite an uproar because these were white people being disadvantaged. But when African Americans are the ones that were getting disadvantaged, it didn't cause so much of an uproar. So it's very difficult. I think there's still a fair amount of prejudice out there, and a lot of it's come uncorked in the last 4 years. It's a very heavy lift. And the more directly you come in, the more directly the contact that's implied by desegregation, the more resistance there is. So schools and neighborhoods tend to get the most resistance. Jobs, less, but even there's a lot of resistance and discrimination. We can fight it if we identify where discrimination is happening and then issue people tickets or fines or something and then if it's a repeated practice, then they get into bigger trouble. We've just chosen not to do that. And I've testified before Congress a number of times, both on immigration issues and housing issues. And in 1988, as a result of Nancy Denton's work and my work, we testified before the Housing Committee, and it was at the end of the Reagan administration when his housing secretary got into trouble, and they were kind of flat-footed, and he was a lame duck president, and the Democrats were able to add an amendment to the Fair Housing Act to increase the penalties and fines. And so we testified in that case and in that hearing, and it passed. So things can be done, but it's not easy.
In regards to segregation, given the current changes to the public charge rule on mixed status families, how could this create a more austere segregation for prominent Latino and migrant communities?
Well, a large segment of the Latino community is not eligible for any kind of benefit anyway. If they're
Well, I think maybe could you explain what the public charge rule is? We've got a very varied
okay.
background of people.
Public charge rule is that you can be denied access to a green card, to permanent resident status, if the investigating officer believes you're likely to become a public charge. And public charge means using any public funds. And the rule seems to construe that very widely. So if you send your kids to public school, that might be considered a public charge, even though the Supreme Court has said that the children, no matter what their legal status, have a right to go to school through K through 12. But things like food stamps or SNAP food stamps, housing vouchers, welfare payments, old age and survivors disability insurance. If you were to accept those, that would threaten your chances to become a green card or a citizen of the United States. And it's not even if you've done it in the past. It seems they wrote the rules so that if you're suspected that you might at some point become a public charge, you can be denied access to a green card. And that will obviously put a lot of pressure on people, make them afraid to send their kids to school, make them afraid to take their kids to the hospital if they get sick, because they'll become a public charge, and that'll threaten their chances to get a green card. And obviously they're not going to get any housing vouchers as long as they're out of status. And some of the rights and privileges were revoked in some of the 1996 legislation. So all non-citizens, not just undocumented migrants, but non-citizens lost eligibility for a number of entitlement programs in the 1996 Welfare and Immigration Reform legislation.
Well, that's an interesting kettle of fish there. Damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for a lot of them.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really harsh for immigrants in the United States today. It's almost like living in a police state, because if you're Latino looking, and God knows what that really means, but I think in practice it means people with brown skin and darker hair, you're a target. And it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or a legal resident or a visitor. You can be hassled and pulled over on a pretext and checked for your immigration documents. In a way, I mean, if they did this, if the police hassled white people in Darien, Connecticut, or the wealthy suburbs of Dallas, like they hassle young people or all people in Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, it just wouldn't last very long. But because it's invisible to the majority of whites and doesn't bother them, in fact, maybe some people like it even, it goes on. And it's really causing a lot of stress in immigrant families now. And a lot of people don't realize that illegal migration from Mexico ended about 12 or 13 years ago. And it's been net negative. More people leave than come in from Mexico since then. And the ones that are here now have been here for a long time. The average is more like 15 years of residence in the United States now, and the majority have US-born citizen kids. And so when you put pressure on the parents, you put pressure on the families, you're putting pressure on the next generation of American citizens. And the vast majority of these people have not committed any serious crimes, and they've lived in the United States for a long time. And the harsh deportations that were done by both Democrats and Republicans. This was a bipartisan process of border militarization and deportation from the United States. It's not fair to blame just the Republicans, although it's come to an extreme point in the current Republican administration. but it's wreaking havoc with communities and families in the United States and damaging the next generation of American citizens. And Latinos are now 18% of the population, so you're damaging a huge chunk of America's future.
Is it 2048 when we expect to become minority majority? Is that the year that I'm?
Well, I don't even like the majority concept, because the majority of Latinos identify as white, and the intermarriage rates between whites and Hispanics and Asians and Hispanics are really high, and the products of those unions, the children, tend to grow up in diverse environments, but very similar to the ones that most whites have. And I think we're going to see a real blurring of the whole concept of us and them in the future. But Latinos are now 25% of births in the United States. So and you stop immigration dead today, the population is growing through fertility now. And Latinos as a whole have below replacement fertility, but it's not as low as whites or blacks. And they're a much younger population because of all the immigration. So the number of births is higher. And so the population is growing through fertility more than immigration at this point, because Mexican immigration has been close to net zero in total for several years now. And the fastest growing populations are now Asian. The fastest growing segment of the undocumented population, three groups are China, India, and Venezuela. And the Venezuelans who come here are not coming across the border. They're coming out, they're ones with college education. They're escaping really a failed country, and they're coming into the high skilled sector of the United States. But their undocumented population was the fastest growing over the past decade or so, followed by Indians from India, and then Chinese. And Mexicans are negative, and the Central Americans are very slowly expanding. And so what's happening at the border today, what had been this massive inflow of Mexican workers coming in for jobs is gone, and it's been replaced by a much, much smaller inflow of families. And they're not coming for jobs, they're coming for refuge. And they're escaping terrible conditions in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala that really are a direct result of our intervention there in the 1980s. And we're not really accepting any responsibility for the conditions that exist there, that really happened because we intervened in a big way in the Cold War. And if you look at the GDP per capita, last year, since the Sandinistas came to power and the US started intervening, the GDP per capita fell in absolute terms from 1979 to around the mid 1980s. And it didn't get back to the 1979 level until 2011. And so it's just permanent degradation of the economy in those frontline countries. And then other countries in Central America, Belize, Panama, and Costa Rica, they didn't experience that massive destruction of their economies. And the violence never left after the cycles of violence started that went with our intervention. And so, when the US intervened in Vietnam and that didn't turn out so well, and there was a massive exodus of boat people, back then we felt we had a moral obligation to take them in, and we took in over 10 years about 1.2 million boat people, and they processed them as asylum seekers and refugees, and got them green cards, and they integrate into the country pretty well. And the number of people coming out of Central America is much smaller. The population of Central America is much smaller than Southeast Asia, and we could process them as asylum seekers and get them involved, and they would integrate as well. But we're choosing to not even obey our own laws and turn them back at the border, forcing them, if they want to apply for asylum, to cross the border without authorization and then turn themselves into a border patrol officer. They're not trying to escape like Mexicans were. Mexicans didn't want to get caught, and if they got caught, they wanted to be put back as soon as possible so they could try again. These people want to stay, and they're fleeing conditions that we have a large measure of responsibility for creating, and we're treating them instead like criminals.
Okay, I don't see any more live questions. And I think we're just about out of time. So I'm sure that everybody would join me. I wish we could all clap for you live, but unfortunately that's not the case right
That's
now.
okay. I'm used to when one hand claps, it's like the Zen clapping, you know.
And I hope that you all will join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for a panel about immigration with Dr. Massey and several Texas Tech professors.
Yeah, I know a lot about immigration too.
Yeah, just a little. Thank you all. Good to see you.
Okay, see you
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Bye.